In the middle of his billion-dollar world, Elliot found a stranger's briefcase, and inside it, a single plea. Please be kind to my daughter. He didn't know the girl, but the moment her eyes met his, walking away wasn't and being an option. Elliot Rhodes closed the door to his office with the quiet finality of someone who had just survived another battle. The investor meeting had dragged on longer than expected, full of questions designed to corner him, numbers thrown around like weapons, and sharp smiles that meant nothing. He was used to it. At 35, he'd already built a reputation for being sharp, decisive, and nearly impossible to read. People either respected him or feared him. Sometimes both. He preferred it that way. It kept things simple. He dropped his briefcase onto the glass desk, loosened his tie, and sighed. The city glowed behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows, its endless buzz a dull hum in the background. He rubbed his temples, sat down, and flipped open the briefcase to pull out his notes. But something was wrong. The inside was too light. The leather file was missing. The tablet he always kept in the side pocket wasn't there. Instead, nestled in the center like it had been placed with purpose, was a small folded piece of paper, white, slightly creased, and too personal for a day like this. Elliot frowned. He didn't remember packing any paper this morning. Everything he handled was digital, efficient, controlled. He unfolded it slowly, his fingers suddenly colder than the air-conditioned room around him. The handwriting was neat, slanted just slightly to the right. No name, no date, just a single line. Please be kind to my daughter. He stared at the words, reading them again, as if they might change the second time. They didn't. Please, be kind to my daughter. His chest tightened. It wasn't the kind of note you misplace. It wasn't something left by mistake. It had weight. It had meaning. And worst of all, it sounded like a goodbye. Elliot stood up quickly, eyes scanning the rest of the briefcase. Nothing. No business cards, no ID, no child's belongings. Just that note, folded with care, placed where he would find it, where he couldn't ignore it. He picked up the briefcase again and turned it over, checking for anything else, labels, initials, even a stray receipt, and that's when he noticed it. A faint scratch along the corner. His own briefcase didn't have that. His heart dropped. This wasn't his. Somewhere, somehow, maybe at the cafe that morning or during the elevator ride before the meeting, he'd picked up the wrong one. And now, someone out there had his, and he had theirs. And in the middle of that mistake was a message that didn't belong in his world of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. He looked at the note again, his mind racing through possibilities. Was this a prank? A mistake? A setup? But no. The handwriting was too sincere, the message too quiet, too desperate. Elliot's pulse quickened as he grabbed his phone, preparing to call building security, when something else occurred to him. He hadn't seen his briefcase since that morning, but he had seen a child in the lobby, a little girl, alone, watching him. Elliot moved quickly through the sleek hallways of the 35th floor, past curious glances from his assistants, past his reflection in the polished glass that lined the walls. He didn't stop to explain. He just needed to see for himself. Something about that note had settled into his chest like a stone, heavy and strange. He took the elevator down, watching the numbers blink slowly, too slowly, until the doors finally opened to the main lobby. It was quiet, like most afternoons. Clean marble floors, soft classical music playing through hidden speakers, the scent of fresh flowers from the arrangement on the front desk. Normal, controlled, except for the child. She was sitting on one of the wide lobby chairs, her legs swinging slightly above the floor, a worn pink backpack tucked tightly against her chest. Her dark hair fell across her face, and she didn't look up when he walked in. Not at first, but she noticed him. The receptionist, a woman named Claire who always greeted Elliot with a professional smile, stood from her seat the moment she saw him. "Mr. Rhodes," she said, lowering her voice, I was about to call someone. She's been here since this morning. He turned his attention fully to the girl. She was maybe 7, though small for her age. Thin, her shoes were scuffed, her jeans too short. She wore a soft blue sweater, with one sleeve stretched out longer than the other. Everything about her was quiet, watchful. She said she's waiting for you, Claire continued gently. I wasn't sure what to do. She wouldn't give me a phone number. Just kept saying she was supposed to wait here until you came. Elliot crouched slowly in front of the girl, careful not to startle her. Her big brown eyes met his, nervous and alert. Hi, he said, his voice softer than usual. I'm Elliot. What's your name? She didn't answer right away. She hugged her backpack closer, like it was the only safe thing in the world. It's okay, he added. I just want to make sure you're all right. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was small, but steady. My name is May. He felt the name land in his chest, quiet and certain. Did your mom bring you here? He asked gently. She nodded. And did she tell you to wait for me? She said you'd know what to do, May whispered. Elliot swallowed hard. The note. The wrong briefcase. The missing files. The girl who somehow knew his name and had been waiting for him all day. It didn't add up. Not in any way that made sense. Did she leave anything with you? A phone number, maybe? Or another note? May reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded paper. Not the one from earlier. A different one. This one had a crayon drawing on the back. A picture of a woman holding hands with a little girl. Elliot opened it. Inside was a single line. Please, she needs someone safe. I don't know where else to turn. The letters were the same. The handwriting. The weight behind them. He looked at May again. This wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate. And now he had to decide what to do. Elliot stood in the lobby with the note still in his hand. His phone already at his ear. His voice was steady, clipped, as he spoke to security, then the front desk manager, then someone from human resources. He asked the same question each time. Had anyone seen a woman drop off a child named May this morning? Had anyone logged her name, taken her ID, noticed anything unusual? The answers were always the same. No, no one had seen a thing. Claire, the receptionist, shook her head, looking uncomfortable. I stepped away for 10 minutes to grab a coffee, she admitted. When I came back, she was already sitting there, quiet as anything. I assumed someone upstairs was expecting her. Elliot glanced at May, who sat in the same chair, her legs now pulled up under her chin resting on her knees. She was watching him without blinking, like she was trying to figure out if he was a good guy or a bad one. He wasn't sure he knew the answer himself. He paced the lobby, dialing again, this time checking with the building's surveillance team. If someone had brought May into the lobby, the cameras would have caught it, but they were still reviewing the footage, and it could take time. He returned to May, crouching beside her again. May, he said gently, do you know your mom's phone number? She shook her head. Where does she live? Do you know the address? Another shake. Did she say anything else to you? Anything about where she was going or when she'd be back? May's small shoulders lifted in a shrug. Then, finally, she looked him in the eye and said, she said to find Mr. Rhodes. That's you. She showed me your picture. She said you would help. Elliot's breath caught. He had no idea who this woman was, or how she even knew him. But she hadn't picked him at random. She'd planned this, told her daughter his name, shown her his face, left her in his building with nothing but a note, and the hope that he'd take care of her. It didn't feel like a trap. It didn't feel like some cruel setup. It felt like desperation. He sat down in the chair beside May and ran a hand through his hair. For a man who prided himself on having every detail under control, this was a situation with no clear answer. No spreadsheet, no business strategy could explain the girl beside him. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a squished granola bar, offering it to him without a word. He didn't take it, but the gesture caught him off guard. She didn't look afraid. Not exactly. Just tired. Like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. I'm going to figure this out, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. May nodded like she already knew, because her mother had told her something. She believed completely. That Mr. Rhodes would help, that he would be kind. Elliot sat in the back of the town car, May beside him, quiet as ever, her pink backpack clutched tightly in her lap. The note still burned a hole in his thoughts. He'd spent the last 20 minutes going through the briefcase again, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to hold on to logic when none of this felt logical. It wasn't until he reached for his tablet that the truth started to come into focus. It wasn't there. Neither were his files. The presentation folder for the investment pitch he'd given earlier, the backup hard drive, the pen with his initials engraved into the side. All of it gone. In its place, a coloring book with pages half scribbled in pink and purple, a small stuffed koala with one button eye, a few crayons, and a folded paper with a crayon drawing of a woman and a girl standing beneath a crooked sun. Elliot stared at the briefcase like it might rearrange itself into something familiar if he just looked long enough. But it didn't. The brand was the same. The color, the worn leather handle, everything about it matched his own. But it wasn't his. It hit him slowly, like a memory sliding into place. That morning, he'd stopped at the cafe across from the office building, the one tucked into the corner near the bookstore. He'd ordered his usual coffee, black with 1 sugar, and set his briefcase on the counter while he waited. He remembered someone else beside him, another customer in a hurry. A woman, slender, with a gray hoodie and dark hair tucked under a ball cap. She'd had a briefcase too. They must have switched bags. Not by accident, he realized. Not anymore. He looked at May, still staring out the window as the city passed by. She hadn't asked where they were going. She hadn't asked anything at all, just followed him when he offered his hand and said they should go somewhere safe. Elliot opened the small side pocket of the briefcase again. Nothing but a single receipt for a bottle of water and a granola bar. The timestamp matched that morning, just before 9. He leaned back against the seat, his thoughts spiraling. Whoever her mother was, she'd planned this. She'd followed him. She knew his routine, knew where he bought his coffee, knew what kind of briefcase he carried. She'd packed this one carefully. The note wasn't an afterthought. It was the point. May's eyes flicked toward him then, just for a second, and he saw something behind them that stayed with him. Hope mixed with caution, like she was waiting to see if he'd fail her too. Elliot didn't say anything. He just rested the briefcase on the seat between them. His own confusion pressed against her quiet certainty. She might not understand what was happening, but she knew what mattered. She had been left with someone. Someone her mother believed in. Someone her mother had chosen. Elliot unlocked the door to his penthouse with a quiet sigh. The city lights stretching behind him like a glowing sea of possibilities. He no longer had the energy to chase. He held the door open for May, who stepped inside slowly, her backpack still strapped tight across her shoulders, like she wasn't sure she'd be allowed to stay. The place was everything you'd expect from a man who lived in spreadsheets and quarterly projections. Cool tones, expensive furniture, open spaces, glass, steel, dark woods, clean and quiet, organized to the point of feeling unlived in. May stopped just inside the entrance, her eyes wide, taking in the massive windows and high ceilings like she'd just stepped into a spaceship. "You can take off your shoes," Elliot said, then instantly regretted how stiff he sounded. "If you want, or not. Whatever's fine." She didn't say anything, just slipped off her sneakers and placed them neatly by the door. He walked ahead, not entirely sure what he was doing. There were no manuals for this, no rules, just a note in his pocket and a little girl watching his every move with cautious curiosity. He led her to the living room, where a long leather sofa sat untouched beside a silent fireplace. "You hungry?" he asked. "Thirsty?" She nodded, then added softly, "Can I have water?" "Of course," he said. too quickly. He disappeared into the kitchen, poured a glass from the filter, and handed it to her with both hands like it was a fragile gift. May took it carefully and sat on the edge of the couch, sipping in small, measured gulps, her legs dangling above the floor. Elliot didn't sit. He hovered, unsure. He wasn't used to company, let alone children. His world was adults in suits, numbers on screens, deals closed over fast meals and late calls. There was no room for bedtime stories or nightlights or tiny stuffed koalas, which now sat on her lap like a quiet sentry. "I called child services," he said finally. "They'll follow up tomorrow. It's late now. Too late to do anything tonight." May just nodded. "You'll stay here," he added. Then felt the need to clarify. "Just for tonight, I'll make sure everything's safe. You can have the guest room." Still, she said nothing, but her eyes traveled the space, up to the floating staircase, across the gleaming kitchen, toward the tall shelves lined with books and awards he rarely noticed. It was the kind of home people admired, but it had never felt like anything more than a place to sleep and keep his suits. Now, with May sitting there, small, quiet, but very present, it felt foreign, like he was seeing it through someone else's eyes for the first time. She slid off the couch and walked slowly to the window, pressing her hand against the glass. "The lights go all the way to the edge," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Elliot watched her, the city blinking around her reflection, and wondered what kind of world she came from. What kind of day her mother must have had, to leave her in a lobby with a stranger's name, and no plan beyond hope. He didn't have the answers, but she was here now, and he had one job until morning: make her feel safe. May woke up early. The guest room had been too big, too quiet, too perfect. She had slept in patches, wrapped around her stuffed koala, watching the patterns of city lights shift across the ceiling like stars in motion. Now, barefoot and curious, she crept through the penthouse as if exploring a museum that didn't want to be touched. The walls were lined with art that didn't smile, colors that didn't laugh, and furniture that looked better than it felt. She tiptoed past the kitchen, past the cold fireplace, and found herself in Elliot's office. It was different here, still tidy, still grown up, but warmer in small ways. Books with bent spines, a coffee mug with a chip, a desk that looked like it had been leaned on during long nights, and on a narrow shelf beneath the window, there were pictures. One was framed in silver, a photo, old and worn at the edges, but kept with care. A young boy, maybe 8 or 9, stood holding hands with a woman in a nurse's uniform. They were outside somewhere, maybe a park. The boy squinting at the sun, the woman laughing softly at something off camera. The boy looked like Elliot. May stood on her tiptoes to get a better look. She didn't touch the frame, just stared. Elliot's voice came from the doorway, a little rough from sleep. "That's my mother," he said, not moving from where he stood. She was a nurse. May turned slowly to face him. "You look like her." He blinked. No one ever said that. People usually said he looked like money, like ambition, like someone who didn't need anyone. But May just said it like it was a fact. "She died when I was 12, he added, walking into the room and sitting on the edge of the leather chair. "It was cancer. Quick. At least that's what they said. But it didn't feel quick." May didn't speak, just looked at the photo again. Then, softly, she looked kind. Elliot nodded. She was. Too kind, maybe. Gave too much to people who never gave back. But she smiled, even when it hurt. He hadn't talked about his mother in years. Hadn't really thought about that photo since the day he placed it on the shelf. More as a tribute than a memory. "She was your soft spot," May said. The words hit him harder than he expected. She was looking at the picture still, not at him, but somehow she'd said the one thing no adult had ever dared. "I guess she was," he murmured. Then he looked at her more closely. "Do you always listen that closely when people talk?" May nodded. "People don't always mean what they say. But if you listen long enough, you can hear what they're really telling you. Elliot leaned back in the chair, quiet for a moment. He was used to boardroom language, to deals hidden behind pleasantries, to hearing everything and feeling nothing. But here was a child who listened better than most adults he knew. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to leave the conversation. Elliot sat alone in the living room, the city pulsing quietly beyond the glass. The lights looked softer tonight, dimmed by the weight that had settled in his chest since May had gone to bed. She had brushed her teeth, hugged her koala, climbed into the guest room's tall bed without a fuss. No whining, no questions, no fear. Just a small, quiet child, carrying something far heavier than her backpack. He hadn't expected her to fall asleep so easily, but then again, he reminded himself, maybe she was used to sleeping in strange places. Maybe trust, for her, came in pieces, given only when absolutely necessary. The silence in the room was thick. Elliot leaned back into the couch, not bothering to turn on the television or check his email. His phone buzzed beside him, a low hum that broke through the stillness like a whisper. One new voicemail. He hadn't heard the phone ring. Must have been during dinner, when he was burning pasta and May was politely pretending not to notice. He hesitated before playing the message. It could be anyone. His assistant, a client, another investor with an urgent question about next quarter's projections. But something in his gut said it wouldn't be any of those. He pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then the sound of someone breathing too close to the microphone. A woman's voice cracked through, barely above a whisper. "I don't have time," she said, her voice shaking. Elliot sat up straighter. "I'm sorry. Please, just be kind to her. She deserves better than I can give right now." Then silence. Not a goodbye, not a name, just nothing. Elliot stared at the phone, the screen fading to black in his hand. The message replayed in his mind, each word sharper than the last. "I don't have time. Be kind to her. Better than I can give." He didn't know the voice. Not well. But there was something honest in it, something raw, not rehearsed, not cold, just desperate. A mother's last attempt to give her child a chance. Not through the system, not through a friend, but through a stranger she must have studied from a distance. Someone she thought could offer something more than survival. He ran a hand down his face and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. There were no instructions, no plan, just a single plea: be kind to her. He looked down the hallway toward the guest room door, now closed. He imagined May there, asleep or pretending to be, her arms curled around that lopsided koala, trusting that the stranger her mother chose was enough. Elliot didn't know what kind of man that mother thought he was. He didn't know if he deserved the trust she'd placed in him. But he did know one thing: he hadn't been chosen by accident. And now, someone had given him a chance to be kind, to be enough. The sun wasn't fully up yet, but light had started to press against the edges of the sky, turning the windows of Elliot's penthouse a soft shade of gray. He moved quietly through the hallway, not expecting anyone else to be awake. His mornings were always like this: silent, predictable, built around espresso and unread emails. But today was different. He heard the noise before he saw it, the clinking of metal, the scrape of a chair being pushed across the floor, the faint rustle of plastic packaging. He stepped into the kitchen and froze. May was standing on her tiptoes, her small arms reaching into a cabinet, boxes and bags already scattered across the counter. A chair had been dragged in front of the counter like a makeshift ladder. The floor was littered with 2 mismatched socks, an empty sugar packet, and what looked suspiciously like cocoa powder sprinkled across the marble like dirt on snow. She hadn't seen him yet. She opened a jar, brown sugar, maybe, and sniffed it cautiously before placing it back down and mumbling something to herself. She climbed a little higher on the chair, still looking, still determined. Elliot cleared his throat softly. May flinched, nearly dropping the jar of cinnamon in her hand. She turned slowly, eyes wide, caught in the act. Her mouth opened, ready to apologize. I was trying to find the stuff," she said quickly. "For hot chocolate. I wasn't going to break anything." Elliot looked at the mess, then at her worried face, then back again. She looked ready to defend herself, like she'd already prepared for him to yell, like she expected it. Instead, he walked over to the cabinet and reached up to the very top shelf. He pulled down a small tin of cocoa powder, one he hadn't touched in months. "This one?" he asked. May blinked. "You have it?" He nodded. "Never used it. Someone gave it to me in a holiday basket a while ago. I think it's still good." She looked at him, like she couldn't quite believe it. "I was going to clean everything," she added quickly. "I just didn't know where stuff was." He grabbed 2 mugs from the shelf and filled a pot with milk. "Well," he said, "you found more than I ever have in that cabinet. I didn't even know we had cinnamon." That earned a small smile from her, barely there. But it was something. "Can I help?" she asked. He nodded and handed her the spoon. Together, they stirred the cocoa into the warming milk, added sugar, a pinch of salt, and a dash of cinnamon, just because she said it, made it smell better. She climbed back onto the chair and leaned in close, watching the steam rise. When they finally sat down at the counter, mugs in hand, May took one sip and closed her eyes like she'd been handed a magic potion. "This," she said, grinning, "is the best one I've ever had." And then she laughed. Really laughed. It came out of her all at once, unguarded and bright, like she'd forgotten to be careful. Elliot smiled too, surprised by how much he liked the sound. He hadn't planned to start his day like this. But now, he didn't want it to end. The knock came just after 10. Elliot opened the door to find 2 people standing in the hallway, both dressed neatly, holding clipboards and polite smiles. A woman in a tan blazer introduced herself as someone from Child Services, her tone firm but not unkind. The man beside her said little, just nodded and scribbled something down on a form. May had been sitting quietly on the couch, her backpack at her feet, the koala resting in her lap. She looked up the moment she heard the voices, her body going still in the way Elliot had already come to recognize. Watchful, quiet, waiting to see what the adults would decide without her. "We understand you found her yesterday," the woman said, stepping inside and glancing around the penthouse like she was checking for problems, and that there was no legal handoff, no formal guardian documentation. Elliot nodded, trying to explain everything in order, how he'd found the note, how he'd realized the briefcase swap wasn't an accident, how May had said his name like she already knew him. He even showed them the message left on his voicemail. But as he talked, he saw the way they were listening, politely, but distantly. The woman jotted down everything he said, but her eyes kept drifting toward May. "We'll take her to a temporary facility," she said, "just until we can contact her biological parent or next of kin." May didn't speak. She simply stood and walked over to Elliot, slipping her hand into his without a word. He looked down at her, feeling her small fingers tighten around his. Something pressed hard into his chest, a weight he hadn't expected. He wasn't a father. He wasn't even someone who kept plants alive. But in that moment, everything in him screamed that letting her go was wrong. "I'd like to be considered for temporary custody," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, "until her mother is located." "That's not how the system works," the woman replied gently. "You're not family, and there's no paperwork that connects you to her. It's not about intent, Mr. Rhodes. It's about protocol." Elliot clenched his jaw. He could buy companies. He could convince a boardroom of 10 that a startup was worth millions. But here, now, with this child still holding on to him like he was the only safe thing in the world, he couldn't do a thing? May's eyes met his. There was no fear in them, just quiet disappointment, like she already knew what was about to happen. When the woman reached for her hand, May didn't cry. She didn't protest. She just clutched Elliot's sleeve for one more second, then let go. And then she was gone. The door clicked shut. The hallway was empty again. Elliot stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she'd been. The apartment felt too clean now, too quiet. The cocoa mug still sat in the sink, and her laughter, just hours old, had already begun to echo like a memory. He walked over to the window and stared out at the city he once controlled. And for the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. Elliot sat at his desk long after the city outside had gone dark. The usual rhythm of his nights, emails, calls, financial reports, felt meaningless now. The apartment was too quiet, too still, and every corner of it reminded him of May. The chair she had used to reach the cocoa tin was still out of place. Her empty mug, with a faint ring of chocolate at the bottom, was still by the sink. Her koala, forgotten in the rush to leave, rested against a pillow like it was waiting for her to come back. But she wasn't coming back. Not unless he did something. He opened his laptop and accessed the private search tools his cybersecurity firm used for high-risk clients. It wasn't entirely legal to use them for personal reasons, but he didn't care. He typed in what little information he had: May's first name, the note, the phone number from the voicemail, and started digging. Hours passed. The glow of the screen was the only light in the room. Then, finally, a name appeared. Lila Bennett. He leaned forward. There wasn't much at first. A waitress in 3 different cities over the past 2 years. No criminal record. No social media. No driver's license renewal. Just scattered digital footprints that painted a picture of someone trying very hard not to be seen. Elliot traced a timeline of addresses. Cheap apartments. Temporary rentals. One-night motel stays. 6 moves in 24 months. All in increasingly rough neighborhoods. No steady employment. No medical records since May's birth. A trail of instability and silence. And now, nothing. Her most recent address was listed as a shared rental near the train station. He pulled up the security feed his company had access to through a transportation client. Days ago, a woman matching Lila's description had boarded a late train alone. She was thin, pale, wearing a sweatshirt too big for her frame, and carrying nothing but a duffel bag. No child. The timestamp matched the morning May had appeared in his building. Elliot stared at the screen, the weight in his chest growing heavier. She had made a choice. To walk away. Not out of cruelty, but something harder to swallow: desperation. Whatever her situation had been, she had looked at her daughter and decided that leaving her with a stranger was the safer option. And the stranger she chose was him. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pressing into his bones. He could find people. He could build systems to protect the highest level secrets. But none of it prepared him for this. A woman who had slipped out of sight, leaving behind nothing but a child and a hope that someone would care enough to follow the trail. Elliot looked at May's koala on the couch. He walked over, picked it up carefully, and sat down with it in his hands. He didn't know where Lila Bennett had gone, but he was going to find her. Not to punish her, not to fix everything, but to make sure May wasn't left waiting in lobbies ever again. The foster care office was tucked between 2 aging buildings on the far side of the city, where the pavement cracked more often than it held, and everything looked like it had been painted in gray. Elliot stood at the front desk, with his hands in his pockets, waiting as the woman behind the counter flipped through a binder that looked like it had seen better decades. She didn't recognize him. Not at first. Most people didn't, when he wasn't in a suit or standing in front of a screen with numbers behind him. He wasn't there as a CEO today. He was just a man trying to see a little girl the world had already started to forget. They led him through a narrow hallway to a room that smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and dust. May was sitting at a small plastic table, her backpack by her feet, the stuffed koala in her lap. But the moment Elliot saw her, he knew something was wrong. She didn't look up. Her hair was pulled back too tightly. Her sweater was buttoned wrong, and her legs didn't swing the way they had in his living room. She was sitting still. Too still. The way someone sits when they're trying not to take up space. The social worker smiled politely. She's adjusting. It always takes time in these situations. Elliot gave a short nod, but his eyes didn't leave May. The girl who had once stood on a kitchen chair, stirring hot chocolate with laughter in her throat, now looked like a shadow of that child. He crouched beside her. "Hi," he said softly. May lifted her eyes slowly. They didn't shine the way they used to. She managed a faint smile. Polite. The kind people use when they know they're being watched. "Hey," she whispered. "How's the new place?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. "It's okay," she said, her voice small. "There are other kids. And rules. And bedtime is at 8. He looked at the koala in her lap. She was clutching it too tightly. "Have you been drawing?" he asked. "I missed your stories." She shrugged. "No paper." Elliot swallowed hard. "You can always ask for some." May just looked down. The social worker came back a few minutes later, explaining the schedule, the evaluations, the necessary paperwork. She talked about transition, about protocols, about long-term placement options. Her tone was kind but flat, like she'd said it all 100 times before. Elliot nodded in the right places, asked questions, took notes, but the only thing that stayed with him was the way May looked out the window when no one was speaking, like she was already trying to disappear. They said she was adjusting, but Elliot knew better. She wasn't adjusting. She was shrinking, folding into herself like paper left in the rain. And if no one stepped in soon, the girl who sang to her stuffed koala might vanish for good. Elliot sat in the glass conference room of his own company, surrounded by people who usually followed his every decision without question. His legal team was there, folders spread open, expressions tight with concern. They spoke in measured voices, using words like liability, reputation, and due process. They pointed to policies and statutes, underlined passages with bright yellow markers, and listed the reasons this wasn't wise, but Elliot barely heard them. All he could see was May, sitting on that plastic chair in the foster care center, her eyes dull, her voice small, her koala clutched like a lifeline. The way she hadn't looked up when he walked in, the way she hadn't asked if he came to take her home, because she no longer expected anyone to stay. "We're not equipped for this," one of the lawyers said carefully. "You're a public figure. Taking on guardianship, even temporary, will invite scrutiny." Elliot leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. "I don't care." There was a pause. One of the attorneys blinked. "With all due respect, sir, this isn't something that can be handled on impulse. You're not related to her. You have no prior connection. And if the child's mother reappears, then we'll deal with it," Elliot interrupted. "But until then, she needs someone. Not a system, not another unfamiliar house with strangers who don't see her." Another lawyer flipped through a file. "It's not a matter of wanting to help. It's a matter of process. The courts will ask why. Why you and not a certified foster family? Why a man with no parental history, no training, and a full-time job that already demands more than any one person should give?" Elliot looked out the window. The city spread beneath him, a maze of meetings and money. Skyscrapers built on deals he had made with clear, calculated logic. His life had always run on numbers, but none of those numbers had prepared him for May. He thought of the note again. "Please be kind to my daughter." That wasn't a legal argument. It wasn't practical or efficient. It was a mother's last hope, sent in the form of a stranger's name. "She makes my house feel like home," Elliot said quietly. "The room stilled. She fills a space I didn't know was empty until she was gone. And maybe I don't have all the qualifications or training, but I'm not asking for permanent custody. I'm asking for a chance to give her something steady while the system sorts itself out, because she doesn't have time to wait." One of the younger lawyers, sitting near the back, closed his folder and nodded slightly. By the end of the day, the first set of forms was filed. Background checks were expedited. Interviews scheduled. References contacted. It wasn't the kind of decision Elliot was known for. It wasn't strategic or polished, but it was kind. And this time, that mattered more. The first thing May did when she walked back into the penthouse was take off her shoes without being asked. She placed them neatly by the door, just like before, then looked around like she was checking to see if anything had changed. Elliot stood behind her, holding her small suitcase in one hand and a grocery bag in the other. She didn't ask questions. She didn't say much at all, but she stepped inside like someone exhaling after holding their breath for too long. He had spent the last 2 days rearranging the apartment. Not dramatically, but enough that it felt different. Warmer. Less like a showroom, and more like something meant to be lived in. Gone were the sharp-edged glass vases and the cold, modern art that never meant anything to him anyway. In their place were soft pillows in bright colors, a few beanbags in the corner of the living room, and a soft rug that May had picked out online. It was purple with yellow stars, and made the space feel like it belonged to someone real. She noticed immediately. "Did you move the couch?" she asked, her voice soft. "I did," Elliot replied. It didn't make sense where it was. She nodded like she approved. He had also cleared a corner of his office and placed a small white bookshelf there. It held a few books she had mentioned liking, some new ones he thought she might enjoy, and a pack of watercolor paints. A beanbag chair sat beside it, along with a floor lamp that gave off soft light instead of the harsh brightness of his usual overheads. "I figured you might want somewhere to read while I'm working," he said, watching her eyes move over the shelf. She didn't say anything, but she sat down on the beanbag and opened one of the books without hesitation. In the kitchen, the refrigerator had magnets now, bright plastic ones shaped like animals, letters, and stars. They held up drawings May had made in foster care, which she pulled out of her backpack with a kind of quiet pride. Elliot hung each one up like they were rare pieces of art, which to him, they were. He began to speak differently too. Less clipped, less rehearsed. He asked questions and waited for her answers. He told stories from his childhood. Awkward and funny. Like the time he broke his wrist falling off a bike he'd insisted didn't need training wheels. He admitted he didn't know how to cook much beyond toast and eggs, but promised they could learn together. One night, as they were setting the table, May looked up at him and said, "You don't sound like a boss anymore." Elliot smiled. "What do I sound like?" She thought for a moment. "Like someone trying to be a person." He laughed, then nodded. "I think that's fair." The penthouse didn't just look different. It felt different. It echoed with footsteps now. It carried laughter. It had soft places to land. And as May settled in, so did he. Not perfectly. Not all at once. But enough to know he didn't want to go back to the way things were. It started with a quiet memory. They were sitting on the balcony one evening, sharing a bowl of popcorn while the city blinked below them. Elliot had asked May what her favorite place was before she came to live with him. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the skyline for a long time, her fingers picking at the edge of a blanket wrapped around her knees. "There was a room," she said finally, "with boxes and a chair and this dusty smell. My mom had a key. She used to take me there when we had nowhere else to go." Elliot leaned in, his voice gentle. "Do you remember where it was?" She nodded slowly. It had a red door, and numbers on it. 147. He searched for it that night. The next morning, they drove across the city to a storage facility, wedged between a warehouse and a laundromat. The walls were chipped, the hallways dim, but May walked through them like she had memorized every step. When they reached door 147, her hand hovered near the lock. "I don't have the key anymore," she said, barely above a whisper. Elliot reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small lock-picking kit. It wasn't standard Millionaire behavior, but his security team had taught him more than boardroom tactics. A few clicks later, The lock popped open. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a narrow room filled with cardboard boxes, a folded camping chair, and a small lamp with a broken shade. Dust hung in the air like a memory left too long on pause. May stepped inside first. She moved slowly, brushing her fingers along a box labeled Keep, then kneeling beside another marked May's drawings. Elliot stayed quiet, letting her explore. She opened one box after another: school papers, faded photographs, old notebooks, and a collection of sketchbooks filled with rough pencil drawings. Some were of flowers and streets. Some were of her, a little girl drawn again and again in soft, loving lines. In the corner, tucked inside a manila envelope, was a letter. Elliot picked it up carefully and saw May's name written in soft cursive on the front. He handed it to her, unsure if he should read it. May didn't speak. She just opened it and began to read. Her eyes moved slowly, taking in each word. Then she handed it to Elliot, her hands trembling just a little. He unfolded it and read, "If you're reading this, it means I had to choose the hard thing, the thing that doesn't make sense to anyone but me. I love you more than I ever knew I could love anything. But love, real love, sometimes means stepping out of the way. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep failing you. So I made a choice, not to disappear, but to give you a better life. One with safety, with kindness, with hope. Please forgive me for not saying goodbye. I didn't have the strength. Just remember that I always, always loved you, even in the goodbye." Elliot folded the letter slowly, his throat too tight to speak. May didn't cry. She just sat on the floor, holding one of the sketchbooks to her chest. And for a long time, they stayed there together, surrounded by traces of a mother who had left not out of carelessness, but out of love that had nowhere else to go. The morning had started in its usual controlled rhythm: coffee, suit, notes reviewed twice. Elliot had a major investor pitch lined up. One of those meetings that could shift the direction of his company's future. Millions were on the line. He had rehearsed the presentation down to the second, the slides sharp and the numbers solid. But then the sitter called. Sick, apologetic. Elliot stared at his phone, the sound of May humming in the next room, completely unaware of the schedule unraveling in his hands. He looked at the time, looked at his calendar, then looked at May as she appeared in the doorway wearing her favorite hoodie, the one with little stars along the sleeves, and her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Can I just come with you?" she asked. "I'll be quiet." He hesitated. The meeting was at a high-rise downtown, sleek glass walls, suits with tight schedules and tighter expressions. Children didn't belong in those rooms. But May was already pulling a coloring book from her bag, like she'd prepared for the argument. He sighed. "All right. But quiet means quiet." She nodded solemnly. By the time they arrived, Elliot could already feel the change in energy. May held his hand as they entered the towering lobby. The receptionist raised an eyebrow but said nothing. On the elevator ride up, a man in a navy suit glanced down at her, then quickly away. In the conference room, May settled in the corner with her crayons, while Elliot began the presentation. At first, he spoke quickly, running through charts and forecasts, trying not to glance at her. But he could feel the tension in the room, the investor's eyes flicking toward the child in the corner, the unspoken questions piling up. Still, he pushed through. Then something unexpected happened. As Elliot was explaining the final phase of the project, one of the senior investors, a woman in her 60s with sharp features and a red scarf tied neatly around her neck, rose from her chair. She walked over to May and crouched beside her. "What are you working on?" she asked softly. May looked up and smiled. "A picture." "May," Elliot began, his voice strained, but the woman raised a gentle hand. "And who's that in your picture?" she asked. May turned the page toward her. "That's Mr. Rhodes," she said. "He's trying." The room went silent. Elliot stopped mid-sentence, his heart doing something strange in his chest. The woman looked at the drawing, Stick figures under a bright sun, buildings behind them, a man in a tie, holding hands with a little girl, and a stuffed koala in her arms. She turned back to the group. "I think we've heard enough." Elliot cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if you'd like me to finish." "No," she said, smiling faintly. "I think we've seen what matters." After the meeting, as they walked back to the car, Elliot glanced down at May. "You said I was trying," he said. She nodded. "You are." And for the first time, Elliot realized she didn't expect him to be perfect. She just needed him to try. The call came just after midnight. Elliot was in his office, the apartment dim except for the glow of his desk lamp. May had been asleep for hours, curled under a blanket on the couch after insisting she was only resting her eyes. He had just finished responding to an investor's follow-up email when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was tired, clinical. A nurse from a city hospital. A woman had been admitted. No ID. No emergency contact. But Elliot's number was written on a folded slip of paper in her coat pocket. They thought he should know. Her name was Lila Bennett. He was there within the hour. The hospital lights were harsh, humming above him as he followed the nurse through quiet hallways. Lila was in a small room at the end of the corridor, hooked up to an IV, an oxygen mask over her face, her body pale and small beneath a thin blanket. The machines beside her beeped in slow rhythm, steady but weak. "She collapsed at a bus terminal," the nurse explained softly. "Severe exhaustion, dehydration, untreated pneumonia. She's lucky someone called it in." Elliot stepped inside the room, unsure of what to expect. This was the woman who had left a note in his briefcase. The woman who had trusted him with her daughter. And now here she was, barely breathing, curled in on herself like someone who had been running for far too long. He sat beside the bed and waited. She woke hours later, slowly, blinking against the brightness, her chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. Her eyes found his face, and for a moment, confusion flickered there. Then, recognition. Then tears. "I didn't want her to see me like that," Lila whispered, her voice raw, like every word hurt. "I didn't want that to be her last memory of me." Elliot leaned forward. "She's safe. She's okay." Lila nodded slowly, tears sliding down the sides of her face. "I tried," she said. "I tried everything. But it wasn't enough. And I couldn't let her watch me disappear. Not like that." She paused to breathe, then looked at him with something close to peace, even through the pain. "You were the only one I could trust." Elliot didn't speak right away. He didn't know what to say. He thought about May, about her quiet strength, about how she had never once asked why her mother left, only trusted that someone had chosen to keep her safe. "She misses you," he said softly. Lila closed her eyes, her lips trembling. "I miss her too." He sat with her until dawn, watching the light shift through the window, as machines beeped and the world slowly returned to itself. Lila wasn't fixed. She wasn't whole. But she was found. And maybe, for now, that was enough. Lila sat across from Elliot in his office, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. She looked better than she had in the hospital, less fragile, more present. But there was still something wary in her eyes, like she was waiting for someone to remind her that none of this was permanent. The couch she sat on was the same one May had curled up on so many nights before, coloring or watching cartoons or reading aloud with her koala in her lap. The apartment had shifted since then. There were more soft things, more signs of life. But Lila sat stiff and still, her shoulders hunched like she didn't quite believe she belonged here. May was in the other room, humming as she reorganized her books in the corner reading nook. She had insisted that today be special. She'd drawn a sign that said, "Welcome back" in glittery marker and taped it to the hallway wall. Elliot glanced at the papers on the table in front of them. He had spent the last week quietly putting things together. Details, numbers, options. But the most important part hadn't come from him. It had come from May. She said you wanted to start something, Elliot said gently, pulling her attention back to him. A small cafe? Somewhere with books and music? Lila gave a tired smile. That was the dream. Before everything got complicated. Before it started to feel impossible. Well, he said, sliding the folder toward her, I have a program. It's not charity. It's an early-stage grant for community startups. We give small businesses the tools to grow, financial help, mentorship, marketing support. We usually offer it to founders who don't have access to traditional capital. May thought you might qualify. Lila blinked. May? She asked me what venture capital meant, he said with a soft laugh. I gave her the simplest version I could. She thought it sounded like magic. Then she asked if people ever used it to help moms who just needed a restart. Lila looked down at the folder, then back up at Elliot. I don't want handouts, she said quietly. I never wanted someone else to fix everything. I know, he replied. But this isn't about fixing anything. It's about starting over, with support, with dignity. She opened the folder, slowly flipping through the pages. Business plan templates, budget sheets, contact information. A printed copy of May's drawing was paper-clipped to the top. Stick figures holding hands in front of a tiny coffee shop. The sign above it reading Lila's Place in uneven block letters. Lila's hands trembled. I'm scared, she admitted. What if I mess this up too? Elliot leaned forward, his voice steady. Then we'll try again. That's what second chances are for. Lila wiped her eyes, still silent, but she nodded. In the hallway, May peeked in, her eyes wide with hope. Lila smiled for the first time that day. Tell her I'll try. Elliot stood. No, you can tell her yourself. The apartment felt different that night, not because of the furniture or the lighting, but because of the quiet hum of something new, something settled, something whole. Dinner had been simple: pasta with too much cheese, garlic bread from a store-bought loaf, and juice poured into mismatched glasses. May had laughed twice, once when Elliot dropped his fork, and again when Lila spilled water while trying to help clean up. It was a mess, but the kind that made a place feel lived in. Lila had stayed quiet for most of the evening, but her eyes were softer now, the sharp edges dulled by warmth that hadn't been there before. They had all sat on the couch afterward, May between them, her head leaning against her mother's shoulder, her legs tucked under Elliot's. A movie played on the screen, but none of them paid much attention. The kind of silence that used to feel heavy now felt like comfort. Eventually, May began to nod off. Lila carried her to the small room they had decorated together, with string lights and cloud-shaped pillows and books lining the shelves like a tiny library. She tucked her in and kissed her forehead, whispering something only mothers know how to say. Elliot stood in the doorway, watching, the sight of them together quietly undoing something in him. It was the kind of moment he never knew he'd wanted to protect so badly. He left them to rest and returned to the living room to grab his briefcase, ready to review a few notes before bed. But when he reached for it, he noticed something resting on top, a piece of folded paper, slightly crinkled, edges smudged with crayon. He opened it carefully. It was a drawing, bright, bold, messy in the way only a child could manage. 3 stick figures stood under a big yellow sun, one tall with glasses, one with long brown hair, and one in the middle, with a big smile and a stuffed koala in her hand. All 3 were holding hands. Beneath the drawing, in shaky, careful letters, were the words, "Thank you for being kind." Elliot stared at it for a long time, his hand resting on the page like it might slip away if he let go. It was just a child's drawing, but to him, it was a contract, a promise, a recognition. He thought of the first note, the one tucked into the wrong briefcase, the one scrawled in desperation by a woman who didn't know what else to do. And now here was the second, written not in fear, but in trust, in love. He placed the drawing carefully inside the lid of his briefcase, where it would be the first thing he saw each morning. More than any client pitch, more than any signed deal, this was what mattered now. The girl who had arrived with nothing but a name and a quiet hope had found her way home, and somehow, so had he. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more powerful stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.